Good evening and welcome to an evening of stories of love and death in the Scandinavian forests. So this evening I've got three stories for you, and they're about love and death, and they take place in Scandinavia. Two of them are Swedish, or at least Swedish in inspiration. One of them is Norwegian, or at least Norwegian in inspiration. So apologies for Norwegians and Swedes for any of the words or names. My foolish and clumsy English tongue can't quite get round those for you, but I shall try if you bear with me. Very happy to talk about the stories afterwards, but why don't we kick off and begin with this story? I will tell you the title of this story, just so you can think about it afterwards and wonder who is who and what is the truth. But the story is called, these three stories are all original stories by me, but based on classic mythology or classic characters or creatures from folklore and mythology. This story is called The Hooked Horror and the Forest Girl. Many things are happening in the world, and many things are happening in the world right now. But meanwhile, in Norway, with a mighty side swipe of his sword, our hero cut another swathe through his adversaries, felling several at once. Hack, slash, thrust, parry, and slash again. He was a Viking, fierce and proud, an unstoppable berserker, biting the top of his shield to work himself into an invulnerable battle frenzy. Aha! Outflanking him, eh? Nothing that a spinning jump and a scythe-like sweep with his trusty sword, Blood Drinker, wouldn't put a stop to. And then, there he was, standing atop a mound of slain enemies, victorious, panting after his exertions, surveying the gory battlefield. Imagine the scene. Now, when I say battlefield, we really mean woodland. And when I say atop a mound of slain enemies, we really mean a patch of nettles, now trampled, battered, and flattened by his trusty sword, Blood Drinker, by which I mean a stick of green hazel. The Viking warriors were all long gone to Valhalla. When you're 17, and the best months of the year consist of making trekul, charcoal, on your own in the middle of a forest, there's little else to do but dream, and Zach was a dreamer. He dreamt of being a hero, of rescuing princesses, well, doing quite a few things with princesses, or the girls in general for that matter, of harnessing the forces of magic, of discovering the hidden treasure hoards of kings, of saving villages from the menaces of ravaging trolls sweeping down from the mountains or creeping from their caves, of being recognized for the valiant and iron-willed warrior he knew he could have been, if only he'd been born a few centuries earlier. And so, left behind by himself for hours or even days to watch the trekkulbrande, the charcoal fires in the woodland, he dreamt his dreams and became the hero of his own imagination. He'd even spent time fortifying the spot in the woodland where his family's charcoal burning happened every summer. He dug pits, he made palisades of sharpened stakes and built traps, being careful to avoid the paths he and his family used, so not as to actually injure anyone who wasn't a bandit or a troll. Zach had also invented various weapons made from materials, things he had to hand, and created costumes and disguises that one day might just come in handy. However, for most of the time, it was an uneventful life for a young man who sought adventure. even though the other lads his age would tease him and tell him what an odd fellow he was with his imagination and his dreams. But here in the silence of the forest, among his fortifications and with his cache of homemade weapons and artful disguises, he could be whatever he liked. Now, this story is about love and a young man called Zach. So now I'd like you to reimagine the scene. Imagine yourselves in the depth of a forest. Not a scary, creepy forest with deep, dark depths, but just deep within nature, deep in the wilderness and deep among the trees, among the silence, away from the sounds of people, away from the sounds of industry, deep among the trees where you can be who or whatever you want, or with whoever you want, and no one will ever know or bother you, and the days and nights can last forever. If you were to look around, you'd find yourself surrounded by tall, slim trees, pines, dripping perfumed resins, silver birch with their peeling paper bark, the sturdy, straight trunks and limbs of the ash with their broad leaves fluttering in a light summer breeze, and the feathered little leaves and bright orange berries of the rowan, all good for harvesting and allowing to smoulder in a woodland alchemy until they become charcoal. Deep in the woods, among the trees, Zach's predecessors had made a clearing. To make trekul, charcoal, you first need to make a stack of cut and dried wood and set it on fire. But just setting the stack alight would simply reduce the valuable wood to valueless ash. And so to make sure this doesn't happen, you'd cover the wood with earth to smother it, allowing only small amount of oxygen in. For some days, the wood smoulders under the great mound with thin ribbons of smoke spiraling up from the heated earth, filling the forest with that distinctive and delicious smell of wood smoke. Now, to make sure the fire neither dies nor takes over, there must be someone on hand day and night to watch, and this was Zach's job. It was an important job, but not a very exciting one. On this particular day, with little else to do, as the sun started to head towards the horizon, Zach made his rounds of the camp, the place where his family had made charcoal since his great-grandfather's day, before he pottered about, inspecting his traps and swinging his sword, until he grew tired. The most difficult part was at night. The temptation to sleep was strong, and so, under a shelter that kept him dry if it rained, he would sit on a one-legged stool. It's a traditional item used by charcoal burners, and you can check this on the internet if you don't believe me after the story. A round wooden seat would be supported by a single central leg, meaning that Zach could rest, but at any time he got close to nodding off, he would lose concentration and balance, and so starting to tip over would wake himself up. It's true, it's a thing. Check it out. After. To stop himself from getting bored, he busied himself in front of the little fire he'd lit, tending to the wood-cutting tools, the felling axes, the hatchets, the laukniver, the billhooks, multi-purpose, flat, broad-bladed, hooked blades they used for chopping or for stripping off small branches. But eventually, as we all expected he would, Zach began to nod, and as he did, he began to tip to one side or the other on his one-legged stool and woke himself up with a start. After several of these near collapses, Zach decided that a walk around the camp would be better than sleep-deprived stool wobbling. So building up a little campfire, he lit his lantern and inspected the smoking mounds. All seemed well with the miniature hills. The heat and thin spirals of smoke made him feel like a giant striding between volcanoes, and he altered his step accordingly to complete the illusion. And then striding around and peering theatrically at the air vents. Zach suddenly froze at a sound from the forest. He didn't move, holding his breath, listening intently in the dark silence of the forest night. No, nothing. He relaxed and was just about to straighten up when there it was again. This time it was real for sure. A woman's scream and shouts of distress. Away in the darkness, he had to do something. He'd spent years preparing for things that just might happen, and now they definitely were happening. He grabbed a few things that he needed, and closing down the shutters in his lantern so that it showed the very minimal amount of light needed to pick his way through the midnight forest, he plunged into the darkness, fear and excitement pumping his legs as he sprinted off towards the woman's intermittent shouts, which guided his hero's flight. What happened next is probably best told from the perspective of two thieves. Having ambushed a young woman who was foolishly travelling the forest alone at dusk, the two thieves had gone deeper in the woods and set up camp. Clearly, the young woman's fear had waned a few hours after her capture, as the thieves had done nothing to her person but bind her hands and tie them behind the trunk of a young tree. Eventually, she had plucked up courage enough to scream out and shout for help. And one of them had slapped her hard across the face and told her to shut up. And that had kept her quiet for a while. They'd been through her basket, and while they found some good food and some strong drink, there was little else, and certainly nothing of value. They'd rifled through her cloak and even undone her stays, and much to her fear and anger, rummaged inside her bodice as well, but had yet to find anything. So while one built up their campfire, adding more dry wood and making the flames leap, the other continued to go through her clothing. Grinning and sniggering at the young woman, the thief prepared to go through her dress and her petticoats. But before he had a chance, and the young woman was thankful for the interruption for more reasons than may be immediately apparent right now, the sound of a snapping twig at the edge of the firelight made all three whip their heads round to see who was there. While the fire crackled and spat tall, yellow, licking flames that sent sparks rising in spirals up and into the darkness of the forest canopy, at the edge of the halo of ghostly light stood a figure. It was cloaked from head to toe in black, with a black hood and long black sleeves that covered the figure's hands. As the thieves and the young woman watched, the dark spectre raised its cowled head to show two smouldering eyes glowing from the depths of the hood. The thieves now watched in terror as the wraith lifted its arms across and up in front of its body, and with the sound of swords being drawn from their sheaths, it held its arms aloft, the folds of black cloth falling back to reveal that where hands should have been, the creature instead had curved, flat-bladed metal hooks. Then the apparition spoke, declaiming loudly, "Zee, yea, erden hector skrek! Behold, I am the hooked horror!" The two thieves started to scramble away to the furthest edge of the circle of firelight, but the awful thing came on, its eyes glowing ferociously, its hooked hands glinting wickedly in the flames, and it spoke again, heading for the young woman tied to the tree and helpless. "I am pleased that you have brought me this sacrifice." As it continued to speak, it slipped one of its deadly-looking hooks into the rope, binding its victim to the tree, and sliced through her bonds, and then pulled her towards itself, retreating into the shadows of the midnight forest, backing away with the young woman in its bladed grasp. I will now take this offering back to my lair of doom and slice her and devour her at my leisure over 100 darkened nights. Open-mouthed, the thieves watched the murderous fiend start to recede into the shadows of the trees, quaking and thankful it wasn't them that the hooked horror had taken. Oh, it was going perfectly. And then it stopped going perfectly. As he'd reached the young woman and sliced, rather dramatically, he felt, through the ropes that held her, Zach, for of course the hooked horror was Zach, in one of his disguises that he had already had, ready for something that just might happen, and if you hadn't realized that already, pay attention, 007. Anyway, he'd whispered words of comfort to the young woman. I'm here to rescue you. Just play along. But the smouldering twigs that he threaded through the fabric to create the effect of glowing eyes had filled his hood with wood smoke, and now his real eyes were streaming, and as he could see almost nothing but the blur of the firelight twinkling through the smoky tears, as he made his retreat away from the thieves' camp, the bottom of his voluminous robes caught on a bramble on the forest floor. As he backed away into the darkness, his arms wrapped possessively around his supposed sacrificial victim, his gown was pulled off him like a magician, pulling a tablecloth away and leaving a dinner set standing. This time, however, it just revealed a rather gangly youth holding a lauwknife, a billhook in each hand. There was a pause. And then several things happened at once. Zach froze, his face a mask of white fear. The thieves, realizing they'd been duped, roared in anger and rose to their feet in pursuit, scrabbling for their weapons. And the most sensible among them, the young woman, shouted, "Run!" Zach and the young woman crashed through the darkened trees and scratching, tearing undergrowth, the thieves hot on their trail, bellowing threats and curses. It was dark and rough going for all, but Zach knew this part of the forest well. He traveled and explored it every day and suddenly pulled the young woman in a particular direction, calling out over his shoulder for her to trust him. Stronger, with greater stamina and driven by their anger, the thieves were gaining, and the two young people knew this when suddenly Zach called over his shoulder, "Get ready to jump!" Still wondering what she meant, the young woman heard Zach almost whisper the words, "Jump now!" And like him, she leapt over what seemed nothing more than a wide circle of leaves on the forest path, but soon heard behind her a cracking of sticks and the sound of the nearest thief falling into a concealed pit and crying out in pain. Trap running, zig-zag, along the night forest paths, Zach hoped that he was still going where he thought he was when he felt his ankle pull against something crossing his path, a tripwire he'd set, and shouted, "Duck!" The young woman, learning from her rescuer's previous instruction, crouched as she ran, only to feel something whoosh over her head in the dark and connect with the final pursuer with a muffled cry and a thumping crack that made her wince. Slowing to catch their breath, Zach told his companion that he'd take her to safety by a roundabout route, in case either of their assailants still felt like following, and they walked in silence through the night, finally picking their way between Zach's fortifications as they entered the charcoal burning camp, and exhausted, they sat on the floor on some cloth that Zach produced and refreshed themselves with the remnants of Zach's supplies. During this time, the young woman thanked Zach and told him her name was Brit. He blushed as she told him how clever and brave he'd been in rescuing her, and he muttered some dismissive thanks into his boots. But with no sign of the thieves, they began to relax, and they talked about this and that. Although he was smart, Zach was not very worldly wise and a little naive, and when the conversation strayed towards who Brit was, where she was from, and why she had been walking alone in the forest at night, she gently sidestepped the questions before steering the subject back to Zach and his life. And so the conversation continued into the small hours. It was with a start that Zach woke up. It was almost fully daylight, so he must have been asleep for some hours. Groggily, he cried out an unintelligible sound of alarm and began to struggle to sit up, but Brit was still there. She was there with him. And she'd been cradling his sleeping head in her lap. With soothing tones, she reassured him that everything was all right and that she had tended to the träkulbrander, the charcoal fires, as her people had experienced such things. But it was time to go, as Zach's father would be along soon. She thanked him again, pecking him on the cheek, which stirred all sorts of feelings within Zach, and he became quite discombobulated. As she walked away, waving goodbye, he blurted, "Come and see you again." She paused, thinking for a moment, and then turned and looked earnestly back at him with great seriousness in her eyes that Zach didn't understand. "Are you sure?" she asked with a little frown. "Yes," he replied, but perhaps a little too enthusiastically. She smiled at his keenness. "When are you next watching the fires?" 3 days' time. I arrive just after dawn." "Then I'll see you in 3 days' time, just after dawn. I'll bring some soup, and this time I'll be more careful where I walk." Turning and giving a wave over her shoulder, Brit disappeared among the trees into the sunny dapples of the morning forest. Oh, for the next 3 days, Zach could think of nothing else but his forthcoming assignation. He couldn't sleep, he barely ate, couldn't concentrate on anything, and he certainly couldn't bring himself to mention to his family what had happened in the depths of the midnight forest. His rescue, the independent forest girl, and their plans to meet again. In fact, he rather suspected his parents wouldn't approve of a girl who went around alone at night and made agreements to meet boys without a chaperone. But he didn't care. This was an adventure, and by wit and bravery, he had won the chance to rescue his very own, almost, princess. But despite the feeling that the day would never come, of course, it eventually did. And in a drizzling, grey near dawn, he said goodbye to his tired father, who just finished the overnight shift, did a quick check of the smoking earthen mounds, and then ducked under the small shelter and waited for Brit to arrive. The minutes dragged in the humid clearing as heavy drops fell from the shelter's roof, plopping onto the bare ground, a mixture of soil and leaf litter and sooty charcoal ash. The warm smells of the forest rose with the sun. Wet bark, green bracken, thick mushrooms, and the treetops started to steam. In the midst of that intoxicatingly green atmosphere, Zach felt his heart surge as Brit stepped out of the mists, her long sage green skirts brushing the tips of the grass, her bodice criss-cross laced across a linen blouse and a white kerchief with colourful embroidery on its borders tied about her head. She smiled shyly and waved to Zach with her free hand, and the other carrying a basket covered with a cloth. As the summer sun rose, burning off the verdant mists and sending green mottled showers of twinkling light into the clearing, the two chatted and laughed about the other night, about how horrible the experience had been and how clever, brave, and funny Zach had been. Later, the young man took Brit on a tour of the charcoal burning camp, and he was surprised by how much she already knew about the craft. It's something her people had a good knowledge of, she said. As Zach's time in the forest that day came to an end, they said their goodbyes and, holding hands, they kissed, rather awkwardly and shyly, but nevertheless their kiss felt to Zach like the first kiss the world had known, and no other kiss would ever be as passionate or mean as much as their first kiss together, and his first kiss ever. His body humming with pride and pleasure and suffused with teenage appetites, Zach and Brit arranged to meet the next time he was at the camp, at sunup, 2 mornings hence. Again they met, and again they sat and talked, and again they kissed. As the sun crept towards the treetops and Zach's shift was coming to an end, he waved goodbye to Brit, his feelings for her growing to an almost insufferable strength surging in his body. But just as she was reaching the edge of the camp, about to vanish back into the forest among the trees, Zach saw something that made him gasp. At this sound, Brit span round, but too late. She realized what Zach had seen. Poking out from under the back of her skirts was a tail, like a cow's, covered in red-brown fur and finished with a brush of black hair. Brit stood, frozen to the spot, tucking her tail behind her, her cheeks flushing bright and red. Zach knew what she was. She wasn't a human girl. She was a Hulda, one of the hidden ones. Legend spoke of how these women were descended from an ancient race, started when a woman had washed only half of her children when God came to her cottage, and ashamed of the dirty ones, she hid the other half. God decreed that those she had hidden from him would be hidden from humanity, and they became the Hulders, friends of woodsmen, and could bring luck or misfortune, depending on how they were treated. Aware of the threat of bad luck, but also filled with a genuine love for the young Hulda, as the 2 young people stood still, their gaze locked together, Zach, to his surprise, offered up an explanation. Brit, my love, it is just that your petticoat was showing at the back of your skirts. That is all, nothing to be ashamed of. Brit relaxed a little and smiled. After you have seen my petticoats, young sir, are you still of a mind for me to visit you in 2 days' time? She asked, raising her eyebrows and waiting, desperately hoping for the answer she wanted to hear. Yes, of course, grinned Zach, and every other day and night you can come to me. Then I shall see you in 2 days' time, she smiled, turned, and with a little skip of pleasure, her tail bouncing behind her, walked back into the woods. Over the next couple of days, Zach had plenty to think about. He had to think about Brit the girl, and also Brit the Hulda. But whenever he thought about anything difficult, his mind started to cloud with doubt. He thought about their kisses. And when he thought about their kisses, any of those confusing or doubtful thoughts disappeared like wood smoke on a summer's breeze, and he found himself unable to wait for his next meeting with Brit. Again, despite his feverish, lovesick, sleepless nights and scant meals, the twilight time for going to the woods eventually came. Zach's parents asked him why he was dressed in such good clothes for watching over the charcoal fires. Didn't he know that his father had raked open some of the jordovne, the earth kilns, and that his good clothes would get covered in soot? But Zach said, and his parents couldn't argue with this, that it was always best to keep up good appearances so that people thought well of the family. So off he went, this time with a flask of the best ale and a freshly baked cake. His parents, quite rightly and with much suppressed pride and excitement, suspected he was going to meet a girl. Zach, of course, thought his parents suspected nothing and was puzzled when his mother called out, "Be careful!" and his father followed up with a simple, "You know." And that was all that was said. The young couple kissed as they met, and then spent the first part of the evening trying on the various costumes and disguises that Zach had made and hidden in preparation for defense or attack. There was the cloak from the hooked horror, which Brit now tried on and ran around making ghostly woo noises, along with a shambling mess of tattered rags and dried bracken attached to an old fishing net that would have made the wearer invisible if they'd remained stationary in the undergrowth. Zach called this his forest lurker outfit, although now he said it out loud, it sounded more than a little creepy. There were even some stilts with extra long trousers and a large and grotesque papier-mâché head, but Zach said he wasn't very good on the stilts and found great difficulty in getting upright on them, let alone walking about and making himself into a convincing troll. But it gave them both something to laugh at together as they played with the huge mask. All through this and the inspection of the various spears and catapults, pit traps, deadfalls, tripwires, the two young people laughed and joked and teased each other, running through the forest, now painted in monochrome light and shadow by a full lover's moon. Tired from their play and thirsty, they sat on the ground in the moonlight, leaning their backs against the warm earthen mounds, and shared Zach's flask of ale, feeling its strong and perfumed warmth spreading delightfully through their limbs. Looking down, Zach could see Brit's Hulda tail. And for a moment, she looked nervously at him until he haltingly asked, "May I touch it?" She nodded. And gingerly, Zach stroked his fingers down the short red-brown fur of its length, feeling the individual bones inside, reminding him of stroking his cat's tail or running one's finger down someone's back. And then he let the hair on the tail's end pass through his palm. They looked at each other again and kissed, this time with a deeper passion, this time with a hunger for each other, and lying against the warm, smoking mounds of the earth kilns, they entwined. Camera pans up, fade to black. Later, as they lay in each other's arms, careless of the soot and smoke that covered them, their clothes in disarray, they were peaceful and content, talking softly of the moon and its face as it smiled down on them, and while Zach wove ferns into Brit's long hair and she smiled into his eyes. Slowly their talk turned to what was to become of them. That a Hulda and a human man couldn't be together, that their respective people and families would never allow it, and then they made promises that they would never separate and never be apart, and that they loved each other and their differences didn't matter, and that love would conquer all. But as they made these vows to each other and to the moon and turned to embrace their arms around each other, Zach suddenly pulled away in surprise and horror. "What?" said Brit in shock and worry, searching Zach's face for an answer. "What? What is it?" Your back," was all that Zach could say. Brit's face fell into a mask of despair. She nodded, and turning away from him, she lifted her linen blouse to reveal her back. Where smooth young skin should have stretched from shoulders to hips, instead her back lay open and hollow like the trunk of a tree rent by lightning. And through the bark-edged split that ran half the length of her young body, Zach could see that it was like looking into a hollow log. He tried to swallow his repulsion and muttered platitudes, but Brit could hear the truth in his stammering voice. Clearly, a girl with a tail was one thing, but a girl who was a forest child of the trees was another. Breed began to sob. She pulled her blouse around her, laced up her bodice, and stood, her face besmirched by soot where tears had run mournful tracks down her cheeks. And with a look of such pain and such misery, she turned and ran into the forest, tearing the ferns from her head as she went. Gathering himself and shaking his head to clear it, Zach scrambled to his feet and sprinted after Brit. He followed the main track, but couldn't see any sign of her. He doubled back, looking for places where she might have left the path, calling out her name into the moon-shadowed woods, but there was no reply, and he could find no trace of where she passed. After many minutes of running and searching and crying out Brit's name, Zach gave up. He leaned against the tall, straight trunk of a pine, catching his breath, and then began to cry great racking sobs. He knew that his first love had come and gone, and he would never see Brit again. As with a lot of things that happen in a teenager's life, Zach's parents never knew what had happened, what their son had found and lost in the midnight forest. Even though there was never a reply nor sign that she had passed that way, whenever Zach was on duty at the Trekkulbrannalair, the charcoal burners' camp, he scouted the edge of the clearing, peered deep into the green shadows, and sometimes when he thought he'd seen a movement, the silhouette of a girl or the turn of a sage green skirt between the unmoved and unloving trunks of the trees, he called out for Brit. And each time he called, it was with a voice a little quieter and a little less hopeful than before. Eventually, he stopped calling altogether, and as the days became weeks and the weeks became months, Brit the Hulde became like a dream. He began to wonder if she'd ever been real. Quietly, summer came to a close, and, tired of life, began to change from green to brown, turning over in its coverlet of falling leaves, and the forest began its winter sleep. With a season for making charcoal gone for the old year and yet to start in the new, Zach's work and duties kept him closer to home, and for this he was thankful as he tried and failed to forget Brit. But when the land began to stir and mutter in its slumber with the first wakings of spring, it was his mother who found the baby boy. A foundling, his family always said later, although when the boy grew, he clearly carried his father's looks sprinkled with a little magic, as Zach's mother always said with a knowing look. He arrived one morning, sleeping peacefully in a basket of woven wicker outside the family's front door. He was wrapped in a cloth of green sage and lying on a bed of green forest ferns. He was taken in by Zach and his family and loved for the boy he grew up to be, no matter who or where he had come from. He always had an affinity with the forest, knowing the seasons and the plants and the animals, where to find a nest of eggs, or where the squirrels slept in winter, or the best places to track and hunt boar. His hair was the colour of brown bark, and his eyes the colour of green hazel. Who his mother was, Nobody knew. But his older brother, Zach, from whom he was inseparable, would make up stories of how she was a forest maiden, full of beauty and magic. And that was good enough for both of them. Thank you. There we go. The Hooked Horror and the Forest Girl. Thank you, chaps. Yes, it's a story that I know some of you might have heard before. It's from a collection of stories called Jack in the Blood, which I'll tell you about at the end, based on my own genetic ancestry. Yeah, it is sad. It is a sad little story, but a Hilda and a man, well, there we go. Who knows if it's ever happened? But what happened to that young boy? Well, more stories are available later, but that is a story for another time. Let us continue with something a bit more about the folklore and mythology. But let's talk about farming first, because I think we should. Because farming can be quite competitive. And farming was particularly competitive between two particular farmers. One farmer was Old Mother Skrogelgrammer. Old Mother Skrogelgrammer, she was a widow, and she lived by herself. Her children had moved away, and her husband had grown up and grown old and died. They do that sometimes. But she continued her farm. And on her farm, she had some pigs, a few chickens, because you should always have a few chickens, and wheat and turnips, a couple of sheep. She did okay. In fact, she did better than okay for an elderly widow by herself. Next door was Jon Rumpa. And Jon Rumpa, he had a farm which was full of dairy cows. Oh, they were the best milkers in that part of Sweden. Rich cream came out of them. Well, milk actually came out of them, but it was rich and creamy, from which cream was skimmed off and butter and cheese were made. Oh, it was delightful. Mwah! And each of them envied each other's farms for a different reason. Jon Rumpa, he wanted Old Mother Skrogelgrammer's farm. And Old Mother Skrogelgrammer, she wanted Jon Rumpa's farm. She wanted the cows. He just wanted the land. And so there was a certain amount of competition between the two of them. Now, it was easy to see how Jon Rumpa, who was not a clever man, but a hard worker, managed to keep his farm going, and how he managed to keep his cows well fed. He was good with cows. But he couldn't work out how Old Mother Skrogelgrammer managed to keep her farm going. How did she plough the field without any help? How did she muck out the pigs? How did she uproot the turnips? How did she do all that? So one night, and it happened to be the night of a full moon, because you can see better by a full moon. In the days before streetlights and million candela torches, a full moon will light everything up. If you've got no cloud, he decided to peep over her fence and see what was going on. There she was, Old Mother Skrogelgrammer. There she was in naught but her nightdress, out gazing up at the moon, staring up at it like a moon-gazing hare. And then she began to sing words he didn't understand. They sounded like old words that were like his language, but a lot older. And that's what I mean by old words. She sang up to the moon, and then she picked up a stick and tied more sticks across it. So one stick that she put in the ground and tied two sticks coming down, two more sticks at the bottom. And then she dug a turnip out of the ground. And with the little trowel that she'd used, she scooped out 2 eyes and hacked in a slashed mouth and put that turnip on top of that stick. Suddenly there was a stick with a head and 2 arms and 2 legs. And as Jon Rumpa watched old Mother Svogelkramer, she began to sing and she began to chant invocations and evocations. She used spells and summonings, and suddenly the thing came to life. In her hands was not just a scarecrow, but a living scarecrow with a turnip for a head, and eyes and a mouth, and arms and legs, and it began to move. With a crick and a clatter and a chitter and a chatter and a hop as it jumped along, it began to walk across the farmland. Jon Rumpa, peering over the fence, watched in amazement as she dug up another turnip, as she made another body of sticks and stuck that turnip head on top. And again, with invocations and evocations, with spells and rituals, suddenly the 2 scarecrows began to move and walk around. They went to the barn and dragged out the massive plowshares and plunged them into the ground and dragged them across the fields. That was how she was working her farm. Magically animated scarecrows. This was no ordinary widow farmer. Old Mother Svogelkramer was a witch. He was going to sort this out. And so when morning came, he hopped over that fence, picked up one of the turnips and a couple of sticks and nipped down to the magistrates. "Oh," he said, "magistrate, sir, magistrate," with a peculiarly West Country accent. "We're West Country in Sweden. Oh, that's right, that's where I'm from. The magistrate, sir, I have discovered that my neighbour, old Mother Svogelkramer," which is nice to say in this accent, "Svogelkramer, she be a witch." "What proof do you have?" said the magistrate. "Here, look, I got a turnip with a face on it and some sticks." And the magistrate peered at the evidence and said, "It's not really a lot to go on, is it? This is just a turnip and some sticks. You're going to have to do better than this, Mr. Rumpa. You're going to have to do better than this before I can arrest her and try her for witchcraft. Bring me back some better evidence." "Right, sir. Right, as I will. I will do that," he said. And off he went back home. Now, time passed, and he suddenly noticed that old Mother Svogelkramer next door, she was making cheese. She was manufacturing cheese. Now, she had chickens. You can't make cheese out of chickens. And she had wheat and turnips and whatnot, and she had pigs, and surely she wasn't making pig cheese. That's not a thing, is it? Pig cheese. Surely it's not a thing. If it was a nice thing, it would be a thing, wouldn't it? It's not. No one makes pig cheese. There must be a reason. Answers on the postcard, please. Where was she getting the milk from? He wasn't selling it to her. No one else was selling it to her. So he waited for the next full moon, and he waited outside, and he went to his fence, and he peered over the fence. And sure enough, as that moon shone in the sky like a bright and shining wheel of cheese itself, from her house came old Mother Svogelkramer. But this time, instead of uprooting turnips, she was there singing old words and then using invocations and evocations, spells and rituals. And while she was doing such, she was tying together little pieces of wood, little twigs and little bones and feathers. She was tying it together with rough spun wool made from the fleece of the sheep. And there, mounting it on the front, she put a skull, the skull of a hare. She mounted this onto the front, tied it on, and stuck one of the sticks up in the hole at the back where your spinal column comes from. Tied it up. And then she popped it on the floor, and with her invocations and her evocations, her spells and her rituals, sure enough, suddenly it moved. And then, with a clitter and a clatter, and a chitter and a chatter and a hop as it jumped along, the strange little bone and wood hair scarecrow, a harecrow, a harecrow, the scarecrow with the hare's skull ran across the field. It jinked this way and jinked that and jinked back and jinked, zigzag, zigzag, went shooting across the field. And as he watched it from over the fence, it ran into his land, straight through the fence, straight into his land, straight up to the nearest cow, and underneath started suckling from the udders of the cow. It was drinking his cow's milk. This thing was stealing his milk. He then watched as it ran back into the barn. At this point, he went round, he crept around through the dark, and he crept and peered up through a crack in the fence in the barn. He looked in, and as it came in, there, old Mother Svogelkramer got out a pukekarl. A sick bucket, a puke bucket. There we go. That's Swedish for puke bucket. And put it on the floor. And the mjölkhor, the milk hare, ran up, leaned over the edge, and vomited up a whole cow's worth of milk. Not sorry, a whole cow's worth, a whole cow's udder's worth of milk, not the whole cow itself. Cows aren't made of milk. They just have them in the milk bits, the udder bits. Not the udder bits, those bits, not the udder. Anyway, I'm confusing things. The udder bits, in the udders. It vomited up and filled the bucket with rich, creamy, foaming warm milk. This was magic. This was devilry. This was how she was snitching his milk from his cows with a milk hare into this puke bucket. Well, he thought, this is definitely it. And the next morning he came and found what was left of the milk hare. And now it was just a skull with bones and twigs, and took it down to the magistrate, who did agree. It did look a bit more witchy now that a skull was involved, but still, stealing magic? Come on. This is now a world of Christianity. Such things don't exist. If you won't arrest her, said Jon Rimpa, if you won't arrest her, I shall sort this out. Don't you take the law into your own hand? I won't. I'll take God's law, said Jon Rimpa. And he went home. Next full moon, he was ready. He was ready for the mjölkhor. He went in and got the crucifix off the wall of his house, and he tied it to the end of a walking stick. And when that hare came out jinking this way and that way, with a chitter and a clatter and a clitter and a clatter, running and jumping and hopping as it ran along, as soon as it got over to the cow and was drinking the cow's milk, he walked up with his walking stick with a cross on the end of his holy smashing stick, smashed it to smithereens. There was nothing left. That's her fixed, said Jon Rimpa, and decided to settle back and relax in the security of knowing that his cows were producing the best butter, the best cheese, the best milk, the best cream. But that didn't stop her. Somehow she was still getting to the milk, and he realized that he'd got another skull, and she'd got another hare's skull, and made another milk hare. And in the full moon, she was singing to the full moon, gazing up like a moon-gazing hare, using invocations and evocations, spells and rituals, and creating more mjölkhor. More of these milk hares were coming. She thought, I know, I've got it. Soon after, he snuck in to old Mother Fågelskramer's barn, and he found the pukekarl. He found the puke bucket that magically received the milky vomit from the hare. Sounds lovely, isn't it? Don't buy any cheese labeled Fågelskramer. And he smashed it up and burnt it. Old Mother Fågelskramer had to make a new pukekarl. And Jon Rimpa waited until she was doing this, waited until she was building this new magic item. He listened. She got the bucket, and when she was in the middle of her invocations and evocations, her spells and rituals, he began to make a fuss outside, a brouhaha outside to attract her attention. Oh, come and get the old witch, the old witch. Oh, the old witch is in here. Come and get the old witch. Oh, I'll get the old witch. The old witch is here. Oh, come and get it. Burn the witch. Burn the witch. And old Mother Forgelskrammer, hearing this to-do outside, before she'd finished the spell properly, she rushed out to see what was going on, but there was no one there. She was even more confused. Jon Rumpa, he nipped in. And before that old Mother Forgelskrammer had been able to complete the last bit of the spell, before she'd been able to say the words, and fill my bucket with milk and make me rich, he filled it with dung. With poo! A bucket of poo! It meant that from that day onwards, no matter how many milk hares or even milk hedgehogs and milk whatnots, milk badgers, old Mother Forgelskrammer made, every time they came back, and they came back, bleh, 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 and were sick into the bucket, instead of it being milk pouring out of their mouths, instead of it being rich, foaming milk into the bucket, to the puke car, into the puke bucket, it was full of poo instead, full of dung. And so she gave up. The magic was not working. And if you are a practitioner of magic, you will know that when things start to go wrong, you're careful. You be really careful, because when things go wrong, they can go very badly wrong. And old Mother Forgelskrammer thought, I'm going to leave the milk stealing. I'll stick to the scarecrows. They work all right. I'll stick to the scarecrows. He can stick to his dairy farm next door. Fine. And so from that day onwards, old Mother Forgelskrammer produced the best turnips, some quite nice bits of pork. She never did the pig cheese. She may have experimented, but whatever happens when you try to make pig cheese would have happened to her, and she would have realized the results of this experiment are conclusive. And next door, not only did Jon Rumpa continue to produce the best milk, the most delicious cream, the most wonderfully, delightfully gold butter, and the best cheese, but he also became the best of Sweden, West Country in Sweden, because that's where we can tell he's come from my accent. He continued to produce the best fertilizer for fields and farms all around. He would turn up and he'd have a bucket of wonderful dung with him, and he'd empty that out and he'd go around the corner and come back with another and another and another. Oh, such wheat, such turnips other people grew, such carrots, such cabbages. Oh, the farms near him that paid for him and his bucket of poo became rich and prosperous. And so the two farms continued with old Mother Forgelskrammer and Jon Rumpa. And together they continued to live in an uneasy harmony. Thank you. True story. Yes, buckets of poo. I know. I'm curious. I think someone may have told me this before, but I don't know why people don't make pig cheese. There must be a reason. Pigs are mammals; they produce milk. I know there's things like, obviously, you don't make cat cheese because they're not big enough. It's not worth it. Apparently, pigs are hard to eat. Apparently, it's that. Anna, sounds like you just asked. Can we make pig cheese? Too difficult. Okay. I suppose they are. With cows, you've kind of got, especially if you selectively bred. That's not how you handle a cow, by the way. I'm not an expert. But cows have been selectively bred, and pigs, and they've got udders, two big udders at the back with pigs and they've got them all the way along. It's just a lot of machinery there, isn't there? For a lot of things. Yeah, well, cows object. Apparently, pig's milk tastes bitter to us. Well, I'm glad pigs like it. You need a very low milking stool for a pig. Yes, or very tall milking shoes for the pig itself, so it can come in trotting along on its little trotters. So there we go. That's Jon Rumpa and old Mother Forgelskrammer. Yeah. Pig stilts. There you go. That's what you need. Yeah. Pig stilts, Kirili. Thank you. Kirili has sorted out if we can get over the bitterness of pig milk and we can get the pig stilts involved. There's a lot of stuff out there. Milk or bacon? Yeah, I suppose that's the problem. That's the thing, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, hang on. Pig milk. Someone's just, Jules has just put in a link to a wiki page on pig milk. Pig milk is seldom obtained for human uses and is not considered to be a viable agricultural product. Several attempts have been made to produce pig milk cheese, some of which have been successful. Oh yeah, there's a whole article there on Wiki about the difficulty in milking pigs. Considered difficult. There we go. And the sow doesn't like it. I have heard of. So we're getting onto pigs too much. I have another story for you. The main story I want to tell you tonight. That when you have perhaps a young, first-time mother, the sow, of how not being aware really what to do and not kind of sure what the piglets wanted, that farmers in the olden days, I'm sure there are other solutions these days, in the olden days would have given the sow a pint of beer, a pint of ale, and of course it's delicious, nom 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 to the pig. And then she gets a bit pissed and then decides to have a lie down, and all the piglets quickly, and once they've done it once, then the sow's like, oh yeah, we've got to do that. The old mother, Fågelskrammer, I think she was just too distressed by her lack of milk, the magic of the milk hairs. And when suddenly, if you've been doing magic that produces milk and it suddenly turns into poo, you've got to be careful. Susanna Montgomery, Countess of Eglinton, used to wash her face with pig milk and then drink it. She recommended this treatment to others as she believed it would help retain one's figure and complexion. Well, there we go. Thanks to the who's J? I've just got the initial J on there. Jules, thank you. And the Susanna Montgomery, Countess of Eglinton. So there we go. There we go, kids. If you can get them to do it, you can wash your face in pig milk. Let me now tell you our last story for this evening. Well, just to say, when I originally, this is from a bit of kind of Swedish Christian mythology, or the creature, for want of a better word, is. When I first wrote this, I wrote this and I read it back several times, and before I told it for the first time, and I really wasn't sure whether I should tell this or not, because it's quite. There we go. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the pictures that I will attempt to conjure for you with this final story for this evening. When we are young, we do many things that in adult life we may look back on and think are foolish. And most of these things are trivial little matters that we can fondly smile at through the lens of maturity and shake our heads. But some of these things that we look back at with the sobriety of age and experience are things that will have changed our lives forever, and no amount of tears will wash away. In the south of Sweden is Ystad, a place that today is a thriving coastal port with connections to the big cities. But once, not so long ago, was a small town with other small villages and dwellings close by, and the forests of tall pines that marched down to the dark rocks and the steel grey sea. And near the town of Ystad, a young man and a young woman fell in love. Per and Anya had grown up as near neighbours and played together as children. And as adolescents, they held hands and made flower garlands for their hair, and felt a surging thrill and their hearts swell when they left their homes to meet each other. As they grew a little older, their love became less that of two children and more that of a young man and a young woman. They became engaged to be married, and being good, God-fearing young people, decided to save themselves, for their wedding night. There was great excitement as they planned their lives, when they would live in their own cottage in the woods, surround themselves with children, and grow old together and die in each other's arms at a great age. But as the weeks passed and their wedding approached, war was brewing. Before they could seal their love as husband and wife, Per was conscripted into the army of the local nobleman to go and fight far away on the sort of causes that rich men always send poorer men's sons to bleed and die for. But the night before Per left, the two young lovers returned to the woods and the glades where they played as children, and on soft, deer-cropped grass under a moon of pure silver, they sealed their love, if not as husband and wife, then as man and woman. When the days became weeks and the weeks became months, two things happened. Firstly, word returned to the little town that the nobleman's war had gone badly for him, and Per did not return with the other young men who limped and stumbled and wept their ways back to their families and tried to remember what life had been like before they had left for war. Secondly, as the year grew, so Anya's belly swelled with new life, and the baby she carried was some consolation for the tears she wept daily for her lifelong love. Today, bearing a child without a father's ring on the finger is something not so strange. But back in the old days, a child out of wedlock was sinful, almost criminal. Without Per to be her husband and father to their child, Anya's father, who cared more about honor than love, confined her to the family home for the duration of her pregnancy and told people she was in mourning, grieving for her betrothed. Anya's mother tried to help and plead with her husband, but he was intractable and met any requests with increasing fury as his pride began to poison him so much that Anya and her mother ceased petitioning for leniency out of fear for their safety and that of their unborn child. When Anya's time came, no midwife was called, and her mother helped her daughter as best she could through the agonies of birth and to bring new life into our world. Finally, Anya's ordeal was over, and through her sweat and her tears, she smiled at the sound of her little boy's first cry. That first voicing also brought Anya's father into the room, and after staring at his daughter and wife, both drenched in sweat and smeared with blood, he walked over and took his little grandson from his daughter's arms, swaddled in a soft cloth, and looked into the small face as the baby stretched and yawned and cried out for its first food. For one perfect moment, four souls, one so very new, hung in a timeless infinity together, and there was hope once more. But when Anya's father looked up, his eyes were as hard and cold as stones. "You have made me do this," was all he said to the women as he turned, still holding the child, and left the room with him. Anya, too weak to rise from her bed, cried out desperately. Her mother ran to her husband and pulled on him, pleading, but he knocked her to the floor. She rose and he knocked her down again and again until she was too dazed to rise. Then he left the house with the baby boy and headed into the darkening woods. When he returned later, he was alone. That night, as Anya's milk flowed unabated, so did her tears. And despite her weakened state, she dressed, gathered her skirts around her, and crept out of the house. She walked deep into the forest, straining her ears for any sound that could have been the cry of a newborn. And in the dark, she crawled on her hands and knees through roots and brambles and thickets, searching. In the morning, Anya's parents found she was gone. Her father headed into the trees and some hours later returned, carrying his daughter near death, her skin, her hands, her face, even her now sightless eyes pierced and torn by briars and thorns. And slowly, slowly, like the first frost of winter bruising a summer petal, it began to dawn on Anya's father what he had done. Time, however, as it often does, plastered over the cracks of tragedy, and life continued. And in that time, the nobleman for whom so many had fought and been killed died peacefully in his own bed, in his own home, surrounded by comfort and his family. As the passing years became passing decades, everyone forgot about the war, and the men who never returned drifted like summer down into history and were only remembered in the nighttime tears of the remaining loved ones' dreams. But what people couldn't forget was something that appeared less than a year after those forgotten men had gone to war, as something that was said to haunt the forest in lonely places, something that would moan and cry, something with a small body but a large head and big, soft, luminous eyes that wrapped itself in blankets and pleaded with travelers who dared to still be among the tall trees as the sun sank and the dark rose, something that pleaded to be carried to the town, pleaded to be carried to the graveyard there. The apparition had never harmed the people that happened across it, although it sent those that saw it running into the first tavern they could find in town with their heart in their mouth, a fear for their immortal soul and a thirst for strong drink. There was talk of trolls, but everyone knew that trolls didn't behave like this thing, and no one knew what it was. And if this wasn't bad enough, a witch was rumored to have taken up residence in the forest. It was said she was blind, but could see through eyes on the tips of her fingers and would eat unwary travelers. So between the witch and the wailing wraith, the area of the forest they haunted was given a wide berth by all and became an untraveled wilderness. One day, in those later years, a beggar came to Ystad, which by now was beginning to prosper and increasing in size almost daily. He was lame and limped painfully, dragging one leg. Under his wide-brimmed hat, he wore a cloth that covered his head and face, with two rough cut holes allowed his eyes to see, shining through from his veiled and shadowed visage. His coat, perhaps once respectable, was threadbare and filthy from the road. His breeches were patched and scuffed leather gloves covered his hands. A few people threw small coins into the bowl he held up to passers-by, but most ignored him, pretending they hadn't seen the man, despite his pleading for alms for an old soldier. Anyway, everyone knew all beggars claimed to be soldiers to provoke sympathy, when they should instead be putting their backs into honest toil. While he sat in the dust of the street next to a trough where people came to water their horses, a group of local children thought they would have some sport and began throwing stones at the man. Oh, how they slapped their hands on their legs and howled with laughter as the man shouted at them and tried to struggle to his feet. The youths were ignored by the townsfolk as they laughed and pointed when the stones hit the beggar painfully in the face. But then one of the boys yelped as the one man who had seen what was happening had cuffed him around the head and sent the huddle away, admonishing them for their cruelty and advising them to pray to God that they should never find themselves in the street and in need of help and being set upon by such a pack of dogs. The beggar began to thank the stranger for his intervention, but was caught by a coughing fit and held a rag up to his mouth under his face covering. When he withdrew it, was spotted with blood. The kindly stranger A man with a chest and belly like a barrel and a face with jowls that showed him to be a man of plenty, stuck his thumbs into the ample waistband of his apron, looked down on the beggar and asked one word. Plague. When the beggar had recovered his breath, he replied, I may as well have the pestilence upon me for all that it brings, kind sir, but no. I had the honour to fight for his lordship's father, the honour to be wounded in battle, and now have the honour to drag this broken body through the world, depending on the kindness of strangers to keep the reaper from my heels. The stranger's brow furrowed in pity, but he pointed to the cloth over the beggar's face. Show me. The beggar lifted the cloth to reveal his face to the stranger, who saw skin that, while it was not corrupted, not rotten with disease or decay, was scorched, hardened, and tortured like livid tree bark. And from the scarred and ruined face looked two clear and bright eyes, and it was these more than the scars that made the kindly stranger look away, his own eyes pricking with tears. Powder burn, explained the beggar. I was a gunner, part of a cannon crew. We loaded the powder down the barrel, rammed it tight, loaded a shot, and lit the fuse, but instead of firing, the cannon exploded. The rest of the crew were killed, but I was mercifully saved. The beggar replaced his veil. My inn's not far from here, said the stranger. You may rest in my parlour, and I'll give you a warm meal, an ale, and a bath, but then you must be on your way. After the beggar had bathed, eaten a hearty meal of stew and dark bread, and drunk deep of sweet ale, he sat, wrapped in a blanket, while his clothes, washed by the innkeeper's staff, dried in front of the fire. He and the innkeeper had been talking, and it transpired that many years ago the beggar had lived not far from the town, and that he meant to continue his journey on into the forest despite his failing health. My limbs have been broken, my skin blistered, and my chest bleeds as I breathe, but my spirit is strong, said the beggar. And it will need to be if you're to travel into the woods, replied the innkeeper, and he spoke of the diminutive phantom that haunted the forest, crying out to be picked up, to be carried, and of the witch with the eyes on her fingertips who yearned for human flesh. But the beggar was resolute. After a while, the old crippled man began to nod in his chair, and despite his earlier resolve that he should move on after resting, the innkeeper quietly crept out of the parlour and let the man sleep the night before the warmth of the fire. In the morning, the beggar was gone. The blanket he borrowed, neatly folded, and the few coins he'd gathered from the previous day left on top of a brief and painfully written note of thanks for the innkeeper's kindness. For many hours, the beggar walked into the woods, his progress slowed by his infirmity and needing to stop to catch his breath, which rasped painfully. The paths he followed were overgrown, as few folk had walked these ways since the appearance of the crying, moaning spirit and the hungry witch. But the beggar knew them well, and pushed aside branches and clambered over fallen trees as the day wore on. The sun tipped over its zenith and started to slide down behind the tops of the trees and distant hills, drawing the colour from the day and painting the forest in drabs and shadows. As dusk began to pull up the coverlet of night, the daybirds hushed and the forest fell silent, ready for the dark. And then, in that darkling silence, the beggar stopped, as a sound floated between the pillared trunks of pine and birch and rowan, the distant sound of singing in a frail and weary voice. Don't cry, my baby. Little boy, do not fear. The night is not empty. Your mother is near. The words were repeated again and again like a lullaby, a sad, mournful refrain. The beggar listened for a while, the words filling his heart with the sadness of the song, and was just about to start off again when another sound echoed through the gloomy trees from far away. A high, keening cut through the night, somewhere between the lonely cry of a cat and a screech owl's call, and it chilled him and turned his spine to water. In response to the keening and singing, the voices moved off, floating further away from the beggar into the forest until both sounds faded away into the deepening of the forest night. Fearful, then suddenly, for the very first time in many years, feeling acutely alone, the beggar pressed on with his journey until the dark became too deep and he found a nook between two large roots of a tree and lay down on the soft carpet of needles, and exhaustion overtook him. When morning came, the beggar was awoken by the sun. The warm, yellow light of dawn threaded through the branches, and a crystal glitter of dew sparkled over the man's clothing. For a moment, the world was only beauty, and the beggar took that time and relished the moment of perfection before painfully stretching out the stiffness in his limbs from a night on the ground and his old wounds. He looked around to get his bearings, only to find that rather than sleeping between the roots of a tree, he had spent the night nestled between two graves, their earth mounds rising gently on either side of him, holding him like a child in the arms of a parent. Roughly fashioned crosses were driven into the heads of each plot. Stricken with surprise and horror and shame, the beggar cried out and scrabbled to move off the graves, trying to get clear of the area, but starting a coughing fit that brought blood to his lips and tears to his eyes. Panting, gasping for breath, the beggar struggled to his feet to take in his surroundings. He could now see that the graves were not new, and grass had grown over them through the years. But what he was more interested in was the house that was nearby. It was a typical woodlander's cottage with one ground floor and an attic, usually where the children would have slept. The walls were made from whole trunks and the gaps filled on the outside with daub to protect against the harsh winter, and inside, rough cast and lime would have made the walls smooth and white. The roof was tiled with wooden shingles and a stone and mortar chimney thrust up at one end of the building. When it was new, or at least in good repair, this cottage would have been light and airy in the summer and cozy and warm in the winter. But now the daub had fallen out of the walls in chunks. The roof sagged, many of the shingles having been lost and exposing pockmarked holes, and in other parts, rough grass and even a straggling rowan sapling sprouted through the roof. The chimney slumped and leaned, its topmost stones were worn and had crumbled from the stack. The cottage was also surrounded by what had once been a carefully planned vegetable garden and orchard. Now in the late summer, straggling nets of runner beans climbed up the fruit trees and let their pods dangle. The limbs of those trees sagged heavily to the floor, unkempt and weighed down with young apples and pears. Potato plants, their tubers sleeping deep under the forest earth, swarmed across the ground, their green leaves and white flowers making shady cover for ground-growing berries. A movement inside the uncontrolled but burgeoning vegetables caught the beggar's eye, and he spotted a couple of small bantam hens creeping through the foliage, scratching the earth and pecking at unseen insects and seeds. For the beggar, it was a scene of two parts. He'd reached his destination after years of absence and weeks of painful and difficult travel. He had found the house he was looking for, But that house and its grounds were ruined and its occupants dead and buried. He stood near the graves, looking sadly around him while the hens continued their domestic business of quietly scratching and pecking, rustling in the undergrowth and making small, comforting noises. And it reminded him of happy days in his youth when the world had been fresh and unspoilt. Lost in reverie, the beggar was startled as a woman's voice called to him from the doorway of the house. "Who's there?" she shouted. "Away with you! I shall curse you and eat you!" Standing in the doorway of the tumble-down woodland cottage was what must have been the witch the innkeeper had spoken of. Her clothes were worn and thin and hung from her bony frame. Once beautifully embroidered, details had become unpicked and the threads dropped away. Her long hair, as white as a forest moon, poured over her face, obscuring her features, and she stretched out her arms before her, her palms flat down and her fingers splayed, fanned out, fingertips moving as if searching the air for her prey. "I can see you," she cried. "Would you like to come inside and hop into my oven? And I will roast you and suck the meat from your bones." But the beggar stood as still as one of the forest trees. There were no eyes on her fingertips. This was just an old woman alone in the forest. He started to speak, but his first words were lost in painful coughing. "Oh, a pesta! Bringing me plague and death, eh? Bah! I'm not even interested in eating you anymore. Get away with you and your sickness, or I shall rain yet more pestilence upon you with my hexes and my spells." But the beggar had recovered his breath and found his voice, and he spoke just one word. "Anya." And the woman fell silent, her arms dropping to her sides, her mouth half open. He repeated the name softly, almost pleadingly. "Anya." The beggar waited. The woman tilted her head up towards the waiting man. She lifted her hands and brushed her hair away from her face. Yes, it was Anya. He could see for sure now. Yes, older, though still beautiful. But her eyes stared milky and sightless, upwards and ahead of her, like a saint in a stained glass window. She looked thunderstruck, little flickers of a frown crossing her brow, and it looked as if she was searching for a word, for the courage to speak, and then she spoke one word. "Per." Stiffly, Per limped over to where his childhood sweetheart stood, seemingly fixed to the spot. Anya's heart beat against her rib like a smith's hammer as Per took her hands. "You're dead," she said. "Everyone's dead." "No, my love," he replied. "I was wounded, and it took me many years to find my way back to you. But at last, I found you." "Don't look at me," she said, tears welling. "I'm blind and I'm old and I'm ugly." "We are both older, my only. And it is better that you cannot see me and that you remember me when I was young and handsome, whereas you are still as beautiful in your years, as pale summer is beautiful as it turns to golden autumn." Weeping, sobbing both with the sadness at the lost years and with joy at their reconciliation, Per and Anya fell into each other's arms. Per let Anya's fingertips explore his face, removing his veil, and answered her questions about what had befallen him in battle, how he had been injured both in body and in mind, his time in a monastery, healing from his grievous wounds, how he had decided to hide himself away for many years with the monks because of those wounds, but how he eventually had been compelled to come and find out what had become of his love before his heart ran its last. Anya, however, said she would keep her own story for the night. And they spent the day in the warm, late summer sun, eating eggs from the hens, fruit from the trees, and vegetables from the garden, which restored Per somewhat despite his dwindling strength. They kissed and lay in each other's arms and slept like children. They were in love, as they had been all their lives, despite the long years that had kept them apart, each a half of one heart. When the sun began to dip behind the treetops and Anya felt the cool of the shadows on her cheek, she turned to Per and took his hand in hers, kissing the rough and scarred knuckles before beginning her story of how she had borne and cruelly lost their child, their son. She told him how she had lain in torpor for days and weeks, and how in that time, while the wounds of her body healed, her heart had been sundered forever, and how during that time the shame and pride that had driven her father to murder their son now consumed him so entirely, and he had been found by her mother, hanged with his own belt from the bough of a birch tree. Anya learned to live a life without sight until her mother, world-weary, had succumbed to a short illness and left this world with the instruction that as she had not shared her husband's bed since the day he had taken their grandson, while she would be buried next to him as a wife should be, she was to be lain facing away from him for eternity. Anya then went on to say how on one lonely night she had walked to the edge of the cottage boundaries and heard the crying. It was faint, just on the edge of her hearing, but she knew instantly what it was. It was the crying of a lost soul, a soul that she had brought into the world, but had died before being baptized and was now trapped on earth. Night after night, Anya had tried to find in which direction the crying was coming from, but the noise was so far away, and Anya knew that if she strayed too far from her house, she would be lost and never find the source of that crying. She then took Per by the hand and led him to the side of the cottage. There was what appeared to be a thin rope tied to a nail on the outside wall of the building. But on closer inspection, Per realized that it was her plaited hair. So as not to become lost and fall foul of the forest before finding her lost baby, Anya had cut her hair as it grew and added it to the rope. Further and further it had reached out into the trees, and Per was amazed. At the point where it was attached to the house, the hair was the chestnut brown of her youth, but as he followed it yard after yard away from the house and into the trees, the hair paled and greyed and became the silver that it was today. She had been doing this year after year. And it had been her voice he had heard singing into the night to their lost baby, trying to comfort him. Now that Per and Anya were together again, they could go and find their lost baby and help him to be at peace. After the sun had set and night had fallen, the bright moon rose to wash the forest with pale blue light. The two lovers sat on the porch of the cottage, completing the picture of age, infirmity, and decrepitude started by their surroundings. They sat in silence and hand in hand, heads bowed, waiting for the noise of a cry from the depths of the forest. They waited for what seemed like hours, but then, from far away, flying across the distance, straight to their hearts like an arrow, came a mournful cry. Anya squeezed Per's hand. They stood, held each other for a moment and kissed before Per, coughing, led the way into the forest towards the sound. In the dark, even with Per's sight, they stumbled over tree roots, forced their way through brakes of holly, scratching at their hands and faces, and all the time they walked and crawled and clambered and climbed, Anya sang her lullaby, but this time she had changed the last line. Don't cry, my baby. Little boy, do not fear. The night is not empty. Mother and father are near. They travelled deeper and deeper into wilder and wilder parts of the forest, where there were no paths, until he reached a place where a huge block of stone, tall as 3 woodlanders' cottages, stacked one on top of each other, stood. There were stories about what this rock was, and it was known locally as Yatastein, and commonly believed to be a stone dropped by a giant travelling from the north to build stepping stones out into the sea. It was golden yellow sandstone, distinct from the geology around it, with near vertical sides and a flat top covered in grass and a few rangy trees. And here the wailing cry was clearest, chilling, hollow, and desperately, desperately lonely. The sound echoed among the trees, pulling at Anya and Per's very souls. The sorrow and loneliness in its timbre, speaking of years of solitude and misery. And as they stood uncertain of what to do, a figure stepped out of the wall of rock. It was tiny and clearly had the proportions of an infant child. An ethereal glow, challenging the starlight for its purity, shone from around it as it shuffled forward. It was wrapped in a blanket like a swaddling cloth, and only its face showing, and in that face were 2 huge round eyes that shone like tiny moons. As it headed towards Anya and Per, it lifted up its little arms under the cloth, and in a voice so small and plaintive it could have melted the coldest of hearts, it pleaded, "Pick me up. Carry me." Per stood transfixed by the vision, somewhere between terror and a sadness of immeasurable depth. But Anya spoke with a smile on her face as tears poured down her cheeks. "I can see him. I can see you, my darling. I have seen nothing for years but darkness, but I can see you." She knelt and reached out. The infant spirit tottered towards her, and she folded him in her arms. Then painfully, Per crouched beside them, and the whole family embraced. "Pick me up," pleaded the ghost child, or Myling as they're called in Sweden. So Anya did. She stood and cradled the Myling in her arms, holding him close. "I wanted to call him Arvo," she said, looking towards Per. "I think it is a lovely name," he responded, "but how can we help him?" "Carry me," asked the Myling in its small voice. "Carry me to town, carry me to the graveyard, then I can leave this world and be at peace." So they started off in the direction of Ystad, but the Myling began to cry and wail in such a terrible way, as if it were crying out from the bottom of a well, that they stopped. "Carry me," it screamed, but Per and Anya didn't understand. "Carry all of me," it explained. "Where is the rest of you, my darling?" asked Anya. "In there," it moaned, and pointed at the solid wall of stone behind them. "In there," it bawled. "I know this place from boyhood," said Per. "Wait here with little Arvo. I think I understand." With great difficulty, Panting for breath, Per found the easiest way up the rock and climbed to its plateau. From this point, anyone could see that the giant boulder was cloven, with a great split at its center. Trying to ignore the pains in his limbs and his chest, Per scrambled down, and there in a natural alcove, partway down inside the fissure, was a sad little bundle wrapped in an aged and stained swaddling cloth. When he returned to Anya, she turned away from the bundle and didn't want to know its contents. The Muling, however, renewed its request to be carried to the graveyard in Ystad, so they headed off into the night. They walked in the direction of the small town, but with each step, the Muling became heavier and heavier. Eventually, Anya had to move it to ride on her back, but it still grew heavier. She refused Per's offers of help until, under the ever-increasing weight of the ghost, she staggered and fell again and again. And she had to submit to Per carrying it, carrying him. With difficulty, Per lifted the Muling, and they carried on. And Anya tearfully carried the little bundle, but again, with each step, each and every step, the Muling grew a little heavier, and every time they stopped, even so that Per could recover his breath, the spirit began to wail and cry out to be picked up and to be carried to the graveyard. His breathing laboured. Per also transferred the Muling to his back, and with great difficulty and much laboured breath, forged on through the forest. Hand in hand, it was on the last stroke of midnight from the church clock that Anya, with the little bundle, and Per, reeling under the supernatural weight of the Muling on his back, entered the churchyard. And on a patch of soft grass, they lay down to rest. In the morning, the priest, arriving to attend to his early duties, came across the tableau in the graveyard. A crippled old beggar and a hag from the forest had lain down under a yew tree and died in the night. Unbeknownst to him, one from a broken body and one from a broken heart. Between them was a bundle containing the bones of a baby long since gone. And the priest took pity on them, all of them, and buried them together in hallowed ground in a quiet corner of the graveyard. From that day on, no one was bothered by the Muling in the forest, nor pursued by the flesh-hungry witch. But sometimes, when the sun shone warm in the forest glades, some people said they were sure they had heard the laughter of a young couple and the chuckling gurgles of a baby. And even if they could never see to find the source of this joy, upon hearing it, they themselves were filled with light and laughter and love. Thank you.